On December 28, 1890, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reserve in South Dakota, a detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment, a reconstruction of the regiment lost by George Armstrong Custer 15 years earlier in the battle famously known as Custer's Last Stand, escorted the Lakota Sioux Indians at gunpoint 5 miles westward to Wounded Knee Creek. The regiment was commanded by Major Samuel M. Whiteside and was supported by a batter of 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, the first original breech-loading gun in the U.S. Army. The Hotchkiss mountain gun was a light field gun weighing less than 500 pounds. It was a rifled gun, probably a breech loader, that can travel with cavalry and has an effective shell range not less than 1,500 yards. It was issued to the Department of Dakota in 1877. In the years leading up to 1890, the U.S. government had seized large land masses from the Lakota Sioux Indian tribes. And of course, this is what governments do whenever there's a disparity in power. Governments abuse their power and abuse the natural rights of the regular people. Treaty promises to protect reservation lands from encroachment by settlers and gold miners were not implemented as agreed. Shocker. As a result, there was unrest on the Indian reservations. Many Sioux sought spiritual guidance to assist in coping with the encroachment on their lands. Thus had begun a religious awakening among the tribes of North America. It all began in 1888 with a holy man called Wovoka. During a total eclipse of the sun, Wovoka received a message from the Creator. Soon an Indian Messiah would come and the world would be free from the white man. The Indians could return to their land and the buffalo would once again roam the Great Plains. According to Wovoka, the Messiah would raise all the Native American believers above the earth. During this time, the invaders would disappear from native lands, the ancestors would lead them to good hunting grounds, the buffalo herds and all the other animals would return in abundance, and the ghost of their ancestors would return to the earth. Wovoka and his followers meditated, had visions, chanted, and performed what would become known as the Ghost Dance. Soon the movement began to spread, and before long the Ghost Dance had adherents in tribes throughout the south and west of America. Performed as a shuffle, in silence to a slow, single drum beat, the Sioux performed the Ghost Dance wearing special Ghost Dance shirts. Some believed the shirts had the power to repel bullets, a power that they would need. Although the Wovoka preached nonviolence, people feared that the movements would spark a great Indian rebellion. Ghost Dance followers seemed more defiant than other Native Americans, and the ritual seemed to work its participants into a frenzy. Because, God forbid, the Native Americans didn't just roll over and give up their lands to the American government. All this was disconcerting to the soldiers and settlers throughout the South and West. In April 1890, General Nelson Miles was promoted to the Major General in the regular army and became the commander of the Military Division of Missouri. Miles sent a telegram from Rapid City to General John Schofield in Washington, D.C. on December 19, 1890. The difficult Indian problem cannot be solved permanently at this end of the line. It requires the fulfillment of Congress of the treaty obligations that the Indians were entreated and coerced into signing. Imagine the government actually upholding the treaty it coerced the Indians into signing. The Indians signed away a valuable portion of their reservation, and it is now occupied by white people, for which they have received nothing. They understood that ample provision would be made for their support. Instead, their supplies have been reduced, and much of the time they have been living on half to two-thirds rations. Their crops, as well as the crops of white people, for 2 years have been almost total failures. The dissatisfaction is widespread is widespread, especially among the Sioux, while the Chinese have been on the verge of starvation and were forced to commit depredations to sustain life. These facts are beyond question, and the evidence positive and sustained by thousands of witnesses. Frightened by the ghost dance, local residents of South Dakota demanded that the Sioux end the ritual. When they were ignored, the United States Army was called for assistance. The Sioux were composed of roughly 300 men, women, and children. They were forced into the Wounded Knee Reservation at gunpoint. By the government, mind you. Fearing aggression, the group of a little more than 300 Sioux were escorted out of their reservation to Wounded Knee. Army regulars believed them to be a hostile force preparing for attack. So they were removed off of their land at gunpoint by the American government after signing a treaty that the government didn't uphold. On December 28, 1890, 500 troops escorted the Sioux about 5 miles westward from their current location to Wounded Knee Creek, where they told them to make camp. And you could imagine when they were escorted, this wasn't in a very peaceful and comforting way. It was at gunpoint where they were forced to leave their home. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the Army demanded the surrender of all Sioux weapons. The Army had decided that the Sioux having their own weapons was dangerous, and that the Army, the U.S. government, should have a monopoly over the control of guns. A search of the camp led to the confiscation of 38 rifles. According to different accounts, a deaf man misunderstood his chief's orders to surrender, or was reluctant to give up his rifle because he had paid a lot for it. The army forcibly attempted to confiscate the rifle, and a scuffle ensued. Amid the tensions, a shot rang out. The 7th Cavalry opened fire on the Sioux. According to Commanding General Nelson A. Miles, a scuffle occurred between one warrior who had a rifle in his hand and 2 soldiers. The rifle was discharged and a battle occurred. Not only the warriors, but the sick chief, Spotted Elk, and a large number of women and children who tried to escape by running and scattering over the prairie were hunted down and killed. The local chief, Bigfoot, was shot in cold blood as he recuperated from pneumonia in his tent. Others were cut down as they tried to run away. At first, all the firing was close range. Half of the Indian men were killed or wounded before they had a chance to get off any shots. Some of the Indians grabbed their rifles from the piles of confiscated weapons and opened fire on the soldiers. With no cover, and with many of the Indians unarmed, the scuffle lasted minutes at most. While the Indian warriors and soldiers were shooting at close range, the soldiers used Hotchkiss guns against the teepee camp full of women and children. It is believed that many of the soldiers were victims of the friendly fire from their own Hotchkiss guns. The Indian women and children fled the camp, seeking shelter in a nearby ravine from the crossfire. The officers had lost all control of their men. Some of the soldiers fanned out and finished off the wounded. Others leaped onto their horses and pursued the Indians. Men, women, and children were ran down, hunted, and murdered in cold blood across the prairie. In less than 1 hour, at least 150 Lakota had been killed and 50 wounded. The largest mass shooting in American history. Historian D. Brown, in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, mentions an estimate of 300 of the original 350 having been killed or wounded, and that the soldiers loaded 51 survivors, 4 men, 47 women and children, onto wagons and took them to the Pine Ridge Reservation. Army casualties numbered 25 dead and 39 wounded. The battle would become known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. 2 days after the event, General Nelson Miles wrote to his wife describing the Wounded Knee as the most abominable criminal military blunder and a horrible massacre of women and children. After his retirement from the Army, he fought for compensation payments to the survivors of the massacre. But instead, the army that carried out the massacre were awarded Medals of Honor. I decided to film on the Wounded Knee Massacre in light of the events of the Las Vegas concert shooting. Since the shooting, many people, including corrupt government officials, Hillary Clinton, have been calling for gun control. Without a knowledge of not only American history but world history, it's easy to see why so many people want the government to control guns. It's a reasonable stance to take to not want innocent people mowed down and slaughtered for no reason. The problem is that people don't understand that governments are the worst mass murderers in history, and this includes the American government. Think of it this way. Stephen Paddock was the shooter. 59 people have died at his hands to this point, and hundreds more have been wounded. Imagine a world where he survived the shooting, and instead of being put into prison, he was exiled to a foreign land, a land that included other people. Now imagine that the people of this foreign land decided that they should turn over all of their guns in the name of gun control to Paddock, and that Paddock should have monopoly over gun ownership and the deadly use of force, the immoral use of force. This is what giving the government a monopoly over guns is like. It's truly senseless because you're giving the worst mass murderers in human and American history a monopoly over the use of deadly force, a monopoly over gun ownership. It is only with an understanding of history that people can gain an understanding of why the right to bear arms is so important, so vital to us as individuals, keeping our freedom and preventing governments from murdering people on a mass scale. It's just hard to get your mind around that the government might round people up and start murdering them. Democide is the murder of any person or people by their own government, including genocide and mass murder. According to a study done by the University of Hawaii, 262 million people, I will repeat that, 262 million people fell victim to democide, murdered by their own governments in just the 20th century alone. 262 million people. There is an estimated 350 million people in the United States of America. Can you imagine 2/3 of all of the people, more than 2/3 of all of the people in America being rounded up and slaughtered by the American government? These are historical facts. There is no greater threat to humanity than government itself. The centralization of power and monopoly over the use of force leads to the inevitable mass slaughter of innocent civilians and anyone who dare challenge the immoral authority of the state. The truth is that there is no such thing as gun control, only gun centralization. Guns are used by governments to confiscate the rightfully owned guns of the citizenry. Once all guns are confiscated, guns don't magically disappear from the earth. Instead, a small group of privileged, elite people who call themselves the government gain a monopoly over the immoral and deadly use of force. This took place in the Soviet Union, and 50 million people were murdered by the Soviet government. This took place in communist China under Mao, and 80 million people were slaughtered by the communist government of China. This took place in Nazi Germany because the first thing Hitler did was confiscate the guns. And in just 5 years, 6 million Jewish people were slaughtered in concentration camps. This takes place today in Venezuela, where people are being slaughtered in the streets with no recourse to fight back against their socialist government. They're literally starving to death, and there's nothing they can do to defend themselves. This takes place today in North Korea, where people are routinely rounded up and put into concentration camps, where they are either forced to work or they are simply murdered by the North Korean government. And if they try to leave, they are stopped and put into these camps and murdered, made an example of. There is no freedom without guns. Governments throughout human history have proven time and time again that they are not moral, they are not ethical. The nature of power itself is the problem, because the nature of power is the nature of government. Look no further than the attempted secession, the Declaration of Independence from the people of Catalonia, Spain, to see just how abusive governments are of the basic human rights, the natural rights of citizenry. The right to govern oneself, to be independent, to not be abused and murdered, enslaved. The people of America have a right to bear arms. This right is a natural right endowed by God, endowed by nature. And no government can take away that right, because the government does not have a natural right to govern. The people, the government, derives its consent from the will of the people. We need to wake up as a people before it's too late, before we give up the right to bear arms, because once that happens, it will only be through experience that many learn just how dangerous the monopoly over the use of force can be in the hands of any government, including the American government.